But today we're in John 18 and 19, and last week we did look at Jesus' concluding prayer at the end of his final words to his disciples. It is called the high priestly prayer. We talked about that last week. Because in that prayer, Jesus is interceding on behalf of his disciples and future believers. It is his longest recorded prayer in the Bible, and for me, it is in my mind has kind of jumped into that place of what I would consider a model prayer for my own life and my own prayer life, along with the Lord's Prayer, which obviously Jesus tells us this is a model prayer. And so the Lord's Prayer has always had that place in my heart, but I think John 17 is now there as well. John 17 gave us a peek at the relationship of the Father and Son in the Trinity. It also gave us a look at Jesus' heart, not only for his disciples, but for us as well as future believers. And today, we are shifting, and we're shifting in a big way. If you noticed in your reading, when we started our spring study, we were in John 13, and we were reading through 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and there was a lot of red ink, right? Because Jesus was talking. He was teaching his disciples, and then he was praying. And so today, as we start and we looked at John 18 and 19, there wasn't a lot of red ink, right? Because there was a shift in the genre of what we were reading. And that's kind of like a fancy literary term, meaning that the type of literature we were reading shifts. So there's a big shift today. The genre is going to change. We are shifting away from what is called discourse, which there are different discourses is like a persuasive speech. It's you're teaching or you're speaking and it's being recorded and you're trying to persuade people of something. And so discourse can be secular or sacred. In our case, the discourse that we're shifting away from was a sermon essentially, or a teaching that Jesus was giving to his disciples. And so we're shifting away from that type of literature into narrative or story. And I'm bringing this up because we all need to be good Bible students who notice when things like this happen, right? When we shift from discourse to narrative, from sermon to story, or when all of a sudden in the middle of a story or a sermon, there is a poem. And that's a third type of genre, right? When we shift into different genres, we want to be good Bible students that take note of that. And the reason for that is that the rules of interpretation are different for a sermon versus a story. You see, a sermon or a teaching or a discourse, which we're kind of coming out of, that is persuasive in nature, but a narrative is descriptive in nature. A sermon, I'm saying sermon, just know sermon, discourse, teaching, I'm all lumping that into the same type of literature. A sermon follows a logical progression. There is something that the speaker is trying to persuade you of or convince you of or lead you to do. And so it is following a logical progression to accomplish that end. But the narrative is going to follow a story arc. There's going to be building tension. There's going to be a climax. There's going to be a resolution. A sermon, the main point is often seen through repeated words and phrases, which is why when we were reading through John 13 through 17, it was really helpful to notice that he said the word glory often in a text, or that the word love was repeated often in a text, because those things become these little red flags that let us know this is a repeated word or phrase. This is the main point. This is what he is trying to emphasize. But in a story, the main point is often seen through the characters, how they are portrayed and what happens to them. So today we are shifting from one type of literature to another, and as good Bible students, that means, and honestly, a lot of this we do automatically in our mind, but it is helpful to understand what we are doing automatically in our mind. Like, I don't think anyone in here is going to read, a recorded sermon of Jesus and treat it the same way as a story depicting Jesus's trial and crucifixion. You understand? We automatically do a lot of these things. But can you understand that it's important to understand what's going on in our mind, because now we can do them intentionally and we can do them to greater depth and get more out of it, see more meaning. So we are shifting genre, but today, as we walk through this narrative, this story, as depicted in 18 and 19, I want to consider two different perspectives. And it's not necessarily the perspective, although I suppose it kind of is in a sense. It's not necessarily the perspective of the characters in the story. It's the perspective of those of us on the outside reading the story. I want to consider two different perspectives, one of humiliation and one of glory. And I use that word glory. Can I tell you, I spent a long time trying to think of a word that was the opposite of humiliation. I think humiliation is a good word to describe the one way that we can view the story of John 18 through 19. But I was trying to think of the opposite perspective, and I spent a long time trying to come up with a word. And I landed on the glory perspective. You see, an unbeliever would read through this story of John 18 and 19 and see only embarrassment and shame. I know, because I've discussed the story of John 18 and 19 with an unbeliever before. And this is how they describe it. Look at what happened to him. It was obvious that this man was a fraud. Look at what they did to him. He was arrested and he was killed. And so they just see embarrassment and shame. They would see Jesus the way the Jewish leaders did, as an object of humiliation and indignity. But as believers, we have eyes to see a very different picture of Jesus in this story. I loved the comment that, Julie, I think it was you that made it. How could someone see all the connections with the Old Testament, everything that was being fulfilled, and not believe? It's because they haven't been given eyes to see. We, as believers, have been given eyes to see. That is a significant statement. And so, as believers, with eyes to see, we see a very different picture of Jesus in this story. We see a story of glory. We see his glory. So as we walk through this story, we will pause periodically. We're going to consider it in kind of three sections: Jesus' arrests, Jesus' denial and questioning, and Jesus' crucifixion and burial. And as we get to the end of those three sections, we're going to stop and consider both Jesus' humiliation and Jesus' glory, these two perspectives. So I'm not going to read all of John 18 and 19, but I am going to start reading in chapter 18, and I'm going to read the first verses of 18, where Jesus' arrest is depicted. So you can follow along with me. I'm going to start reading in John 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kedron, where there was a garden, into the which he entered, and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came hither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, Of them which thou gavest me, I have lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. In this opening section of John 18, we see the arrest of Jesus. And the first thing I notice in these opening verses is what I see in verse 3, where it says that Judas comes with a band of men or soldiers. It's a band of soldiers and officers from the chief priest. And I did a little bit of digging to try to understand, like, how many people did Judas show up with? Did anybody else look at this? Upwards of 300 to 600 men. Let's just say that, Robin's estimate is more likely. 200 men show up. And it's Jesus and his disciples. And they show up with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Why so many men? Like, why? Can you even imagine? And the next thing I notice is in verse 6. What does Jesus do when these men, let's just lowball it, these 200 men with weapons show up? What does he do? He comes out to them and he's like, Who are you looking for? And then he tells them, I am he. Now, honestly, reading through what Jesus says, when Jesus says to those men, I am he, it would not even it would not raise any kind of flag in my mind at all. I would not think of this as a significant phrase at all, except for what happens after Jesus says, I am he. Because what happens? 200 men fall to the ground. His words literally blow them to the ground. And so that makes us go, well then what is so special about Jesus saying to them, I am he? And actually, the Greek phrase that Jesus utters to these men is the same Greek phrase that he has been saying throughout the entire Gospel of John. Every time he makes an I am statement. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. And when in John 8, when he looks at the Jewish leaders and he says to them, before Abraham was, it might be John 10, before Abraham was, I am. And then they immediately take up stones to kill him because they realize that what he's actually claiming to be there is Yahweh. That is the same Greek phrase that Jesus utters to these men on that night. He looks at them and he says, I am. And they fall to the ground. And so what is Jesus giving them a glimpse of? I think what he's doing here is giving them a glimpse of his deity. And it literally knocks them over. Now, the last thing I notice in these opening phrases is Peter's response. So just stop for a minute, ladies, and think about what Peter does in this moment. And if I asked you to describe Peter's actions, how would you describe his actions? I know how I've often heard his actions described. I know all the things I've heard about Peter through this night. But just think for a moment, how would you describe his actions in these opening verses of John 18? I would describe them as incredibly brave. 200 armed men? And he pulls out his one sword and he's going to defend Jesus. Do you remember what Jesus had said to Jesus at the end of chapter 13? He looked at him and said, Lord, I would lay down my life for you. And here in this moment, I see him proving that he meant it when he said that. He wanted to do the right thing. And in his mind, the right thing was going to his death to defend Jesus. The problem was, even though he wanted to do the right thing, he was doing it the wrong way, because the right thing was to show loyalty to Jesus. The right thing was to stick by Jesus. But stopping Jesus' arrest was the wrong way to do that. And can we not relate to Peter in this? Have you, or is it just me, have you ever wanted to do the right thing, even tried to do the right thing, but you ended up doing it the wrong way? And the encouraging thing is that there is grace for Peter, and there's also grace for us. And so as we look at this opening section of John 18 and we consider Jesus' arrest, let's stop and consider our two perspectives, the perspective of humiliation and the perspective of glory. An unbeliever would look at this and say, he was arrested. The world would see a picture of Jesus where he has been arrested and bound. The Jewish leaders finally have him under their control. But we look at this account and we see glory. We see Jesus' words literally knocking a band of soldiers to the ground. We see Jesus declaring his deity. We see the Son of God. But you know what I also see here? I see Jesus' complete control over everything that happened to him. Does he hide or cower from the soldiers when they show up on that night? He does not. He goes out and meets them. He is the first one to speak. He goes out and he says, "Who are you looking for?" He's not hiding from them in any way. And to me, this shows Jesus' complete control over the situation. In fact, John even says that he came forward knowing all that would happen to him. So not only is he in control over everything that's happening to him, he is in complete submission to everything that is happening to him. He tells these soldiers 2 times, "I am he," and declares his deity. He is the Son of God. What a different perspective we have of Jesus' arrest. Now next, as we move through this narrative, we see Jesus is questioned by both Annas and Caiaphas, although John doesn't record Jesus' interaction with Caiaphas for us in his gospel. And it's while this is happening, where Jesus is being questioned by the high priests, that Peter denies knowing Jesus or being one of his disciples. And so really the next thing that John presents for us is Jesus being denied. Now, I heard one quote, one pastor say a specific quote as he was teaching through this section of Peter's denial of Jesus. And he said, on one hand, we should not make too much of Peter's denial. Like, we can all put ourselves in his shoes. But on the other hand, we should not make too little of it either. And I thought that was a helpful perspective, a helpful balance. Not to tip it one way or the other, where we make really too much of it, but also where we make too little of it. It is no small thing to deny Jesus. But we also don't know what led Peter to say what he did in that moment. And it would do us all good to take time to consider what would lead us to deny Jesus in a single moment, and then pray for the strength to never do that. And then again, let's remember that there was grace for Peter. And even in the moments where our hearts, maybe because of fear or temptation or uncertainty or devastation, like whatever it may be, there is also grace for us in those moments when our hearts would be tempted to deny him as well. So the Jewish leaders then take Jesus away from the high priest's home, and they take him to the Roman governor Pilate, and Pilate questions Jesus. So we've seen Jesus arrested, we've seen him denied, and now we're going to look at Jesus being questioned. I'm going to read again in chapter 18. I'm going to start in verse 28 and read some of the opening verses that describe Jesus coming before Pilate. John 18, verse 28 says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. And it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. You see, the Jewish leaders bring Jesus before Pilate for a very specific reason, not because they like Pilate, or because they like interacting with him, or like answering to him in any way. They bring him to Pilate because under Roman law, they were not allowed to put anyone to death without the permission of the Roman governor. That's what they mean when they say, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. And you might think, well, it seems like there's a lot of reasons to stone people in the Mosaic law. And that's true. They just weren't allowed to act on any of that while they were under Roman occupation. So they had to come to Pilate for permission. But what it also meant was that Jesus' death was going to be a Roman death and not a Jewish death. I think I asked you this in the study guide. If he were going to be killed just by the Jewish people, how would he have been killed? He would have been stoned. But because he is now under the control of Pilate, he is going to, if all goes as the Jewish leaders hope, he is going to experience a Roman death, which is why John says that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. You see, Jesus, it wasn't just that he needed to die. He had to die in a very specific way. John chapter 3 verse 14 says, As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. You see, the serpent on a pole back in Numbers 21 was a foreshadowing of the crucifixion of Jesus. He had to be lifted up. So what do we see as we consider Pilate's questioning of Jesus? And again, I can't read all of it, so hopefully you have this fresh in your mind from your study this week. But what do we see in Pilate's questioning of Jesus? The first thing that stuck out to me is where Jesus and Pilate have this interaction about whether or not he's a king and what type of kingdom he has. Do you remember this? And Jesus reveals to Pilate that he does actually have a kingdom, but how does he describe his kingdom? It is a kingdom not of this world. You see, Pilate and the Jewish leaders are questioning Jesus because they think that Jesus' kingdom is some sort of secret plot to overthrow and establish a physical kingdom. But instead, Jesus tells them, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom that will be set up in the hearts of his followers. And then the soldiers mock this by beating him and putting a crown of thorns on his head and a purple robe on him. Now, the next thing that I notice about Jesus' questioning before Pilate is that Pilate is not a good guy. We do not need to feel any sympathy or have our heartstrings tugged in his direction at all. He is a bad guy. You see, Pilate clearly sees that Jesus is innocent. And even at one point, John records for us that he is fearful of what he is learning about Jesus and hearing from Jesus' mouth. And yet, in spite of even him being physically shaken by his encounter with Jesus, and in spite of the fact that he full well knows that this man is innocent, he does not set him free. Because Pilate cared more for peace and political popularity. These people had woken him up like almost in the middle of the night. The man was probably tired and didn't want to be bothered, to be honest with you. And so he is fine with letting an innocent man be killed just to get this over with. But he doesn't just let an innocent man be killed. He lets an innocent man be crucified, which was a big deal even to the Romans. It wasn't like, oh yeah, crucify him. Crucifixion was something reserved for the worst, lowest cases. And this man just lets it happen because he can't be bothered, and he is way more concerned with his personal political popularity and his peace. And so I noticed that Pilate is not a good guy. The last thing that I notice in this interaction between Jesus and Pilate is the interaction where Jesus, almost on an offhand way, reveals to Pilate that any authority that he prides himself on having is actually only his because it was ordained by God. Do you remember that? The power and authority that both the Jewish leaders and Pilate were so concerned about losing, and that they were willing to kill Jesus to maintain, is actually only theirs because God has allowed it. Jesus says, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." How we all glory in human authority. Whether we have it ourselves to some degree and in some fashion, and we glory in our own authority, or we idolize the people who have been given authority around us and we glory in them, and yet it would do us all good to remember that it has always been God and God alone who allows any human to have authority. I think one of the most ironic things about this interaction between Jesus and Pilate is that they mock him for claiming to be a king and having a kingdom. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They beat him. They put a robe on his back. And yet Jesus in all of this is the most kingly character in the entire encounter. He stands there with dignity and authority, and he takes it. And even lets Pilate know, you think you're doing this because you have control over me, but any authority that you think you have has only been given to you from above. And so as we consider this second section of this narrative, let's consider the two perspectives of Jesus' humiliation and Jesus' glory. I think in this section, the world would see a picture of Jesus beaten, wearing a crown of thorns in humiliation and embarrassment. He's going to be killed, and his life will end, and his memory will fade away. See, the Jewish leaders were convinced that if they could just kill this man, it would all go away. He would go away. People would move on, and they would forget him. Because you know what? That's actually what humans do. But that's not what's going to happen to this man. And so we, as believers, have a very different perspective. We see Jesus' glory because we see Jesus as an actual king. They mocked him for claiming to be so, but we know that what he said was true. He was the king of a spiritual kingdom, not of this world. But he is also the promised future king, the King of Kings, who will one day sit on the throne of David and rule the world. And on that day, his kingdom will be a physical kingdom. And that is the kingdom that was promised for the first time back in 2 Samuel 7, when God comes to David and makes a covenant with David. And he promises David that one day one of his descendants would rule forever. And it is this same kingdom that Gabriel spoke of in Luke 1 when he comes to Mary and tells her that she's going to have a son and that her son would sit on the throne of David, and of his kingdom there will be no end. You see, here Jesus' glory is that of the true king who will one day rule over this world and whose kingdom will never end. And finally, as I consider the closing part of this narrative, I see Jesus taken by the Jewish leaders. He's given back to the Jewish leaders by Pilate, and he is taken and he is crucified. And in the moment of his death, Jesus again shows us his complete control over what was happening to him. Once my mind latched onto this concept of Jesus not only being in control, but initiating and submitting to everything, now as I read through John 18 and 19, and even earlier, as he was talking to the disciples and describing what was about to happen to him, even his interactions with Judas at the Last Supper, it just leaps off of the page. These little phrases that before my mind had just glanced over, where it shows Jesus' control over what is happening. I want to read just 2 verses in chapter 19. Chapter 19, verse 28, and then verse 30. And look at these verses with the thought in your mind that Jesus knows what's happening, and he's in the driver's seat. John records for us in 19:28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And behind the Greek there is the idea that Jesus is actively doing it. It's not passive what he is doing. He is actively bowing his head and giving up his spirit. And so here in the narrative, we see Jesus crucified. And hopefully, you noticed in your study this week that not a single detail of Jesus' death is wasted. Every aspect points back to an Old Testament passage or prophecy that Jesus fulfilled. And guys, I didn't even list all of the ones we could have looked at in the study guide. It could have been a lot longer of a list. In fact, you could devote probably most of your entire life to studying the connections between Jesus' life and death and the prophecies that he fulfilled. No aspect is wasted. Why is that so? Why? Why is that a good thing? Why should that cause our hearts to rejoice as we look back and we see everything that was fulfilled in every detail of Jesus' death? I think first to show us that every detail was intentional and none of this was an accident. It was not an accident what happened to Jesus. It wasn't an afterthought that God was somehow able to work up and make a good thing. It was all intentional from the very beginning. It was part of a bigger plan, and it was a plan that God had actually formed before the world began. John also tells us that he is intentionally recounting all of these allusions and prophecies to the Old Testament to bear witness to the truth of who Jesus was. We didn't read this verse, but did you notice that in John 19? John says, this disciple, he's talking about himself, is writing all of this down. It's right in the middle of he just quoted Psalms and he's about to quote Zechariah. And he's by the way, I'm writing all of this down for you so that you will believe that it is true, to bear witness to the truth of who Jesus was, but then also so that we may believe. I'm going to leave a lot of the details of Jesus' crucifixion for you to discuss in your small group times as you look at those different Old Testament passages. And the last thing that I notice here in this narrative is Jesus being buried. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what happens here, because there's something surprising in this as well. I want to read the closing verses of John 19. I'm going to start reading in John 19, verse 38, and then read to the end of the chapter. John records for us, and after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. He came, therefore, and took the body of Jesus, and there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night. And Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. The last thing that John records for us in these chapters is that Jesus is buried. So what is surprising in this passage of Scripture? It's surprising that Jesus is buried at all. In most cases, the bodies of people who were crucified were left on the cross, intentionally so, to make a point. There was no one waiting around for the bodies of these people to collect them and care for them and give them a proper burial, because crucifixion was reserved for the worst of the worst, for the slaves, for the people who they didn't have families and friends watching this happen and waiting to care for their body. And so it's surprising that he is buried at all. And so here we see Joseph of Arimathea, who we're told was a disciple of Jesus, and Nicodemus coming not only to bury Jesus, but to bury him with honor. Now again, my interest was piqued a bit, and I wanted to know how much exactly, what was the monetary worth of the myrrh and aloe that Nicodemus had brought? Did anybody else look at this too? So I just did a quick Google search, like how much was 75 to 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe? $150,000 to $200,000 worth of spices. That's what Nicodemus brought to anoint the body of Jesus. That was not typical. And so here we have these two men coming not only to bury Jesus, but bury him with honor. And so I consider our two perspectives. One that would see Jesus' humiliation and one that would see Jesus' glory. And I think the world would see here a body crucified, a death that was meant to humiliate and that was reserved for the lowest criminals and slaves. He was naked, beaten, and mocked through it all. They would see that there was no way that this death could be part of a bigger plan. But we as believers see that his death is a part of a bigger plan. Did you get a chance to read the two passages in Acts that were mentioned at the end of the study guide? In Acts 4, a group of believers is praying together, and as part of their prayer, their corporate prayer together, they acknowledge that everything that Pilate and the Jewish leaders did to Jesus was actually by God's hand and part of the plan that he had predestined to take place. And then in Acts 13, Paul and John actually are speaking to Jewish people in a synagogue, and Paul tells them that the Jewish leaders were unknowingly fulfilling the very prophecies that they would read every week on the Sabbath. How is it possible that these men who thought that they were accomplishing their goal, that they were finally going to wipe this man out of their lives and preserve their power, that they were actually part of a bigger plan, that they were actually fulfilling the prophecies that they thought they were protecting themselves from? How is this possible? Because it was the plan of a sovereign God. And here, as I consider this narrative, I see the sovereignty of God. Jesus' glory is the sovereignty of God. So what is your view of Jesus as you read through these chapters? Do you only see Jesus' shame, or can you see his glory? His glory as very God of very God, his glory as the Son of God, who was not only in complete control over all that was happening to him, but also willingly submitting to it. Do you see his glory as the King, whose kingdom will have no end? Do you see his glory as a sovereign God who predestined this specific death for his Son to fulfill all of the promises? You see, this was the day, this day, when our sin was covered by the blood of Jesus. This was the moment that God's wrath was satisfied. This is the day that Christ offered the better sacrifice, the final once-for-all sacrifice that did away with the sacrificial system of the Old Testament law and tore the veil of the temple in two. That's the perspective that we have as children of God. And to that I say, praise the Lord. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the truth of John 8.